sharks will live for 200 years. And as we start to do the research on how biology works, we're starting to realize we can change the arc of the aging process. If we ever get comfortable programming humans, like being able to build our genomes, we might even be able to extend our life much more than that. But that's potentially as far out as a century. This is why the company that I'm founding right now is not to engineer humans, it's to back them up. That to me is hugely exciting.
Thank you for being part of this journey to make genetics more accessible to everyone. Your feedback is very much appreciated, and you can also contact us via the link in the description. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Hessel. I'm a microbiologist and geneticist that has worked at the forefront of a field called synthetic or digital biology. I'm the co-founder and chairman of the Human Genome Project, right? A project that's working to bring together scientists to look at how we do large genome engineering. And I'm the co-founder of a company called Humane Genomics that does precision virus engineering for oncology.
And you told me earlier that you are interested in the technologies for programming life. What is it?
So I speak about being able to program biology. And fundamentally, all life on planet Earth is built on cells. Cells you can think of as molecular processors, not computer processors, but molecular processors. And at the heart of every cell is its genome. Essentially, it's digital instructions for how to build itself, operate, and reproduce. And so I study genomes, and genomes are encoded in the molecule of DNA. And today we have the ability to write the DNA molecule, to synthesize it from scratch, essentially 3D print it. So when you can start to program DNA, you can start to build biological systems. If you write a little bit of DNA, you can make a protein, one of the building blocks, the functional components of a cell. You write a little bit more, you can make a metabolic pathway. Write a little bit more, you can start to make viruses. And eventually, once you get up around a few million base pairs of genetic code, you can start to write single-celled organisms like bacteria. And it just goes up from there. You can write some more, you build organisms like fungi. Eventually, you start getting multicellular systems, animals, plants, you and me.
So you mentioned several types of organisms like proteins and others. What are we doing right now with those different kinds of organisms?
So today, the technology of writing DNA, which allows us to program biology, is limited to a few 100,000 base pairs of code. So there's two components in writing DNA. There's the actual synthesis of the DNA molecule in precise order of chemical bits, and we call them bases, typically represented by A, T, G, and C instead of zeros and ones with computers. So it's a base 4 language. So you can synthesize DNA, and then you have to assemble it to make longer and longer DNA. And I just said the more DNA you can write, essentially the more complex the organism you can write. Today we can, with a few 100,000 base pairs, it's not enough to write a living cell. It's enough to write the components, the machinery inside that living cell. So those are typically proteins. And so today we are in a golden age of protein engineering because we can essentially program any protein. And mathematically, the size of the protein universe is huge. And these are really powerful things. Proteins can be structural. Proteins can have activity to build things or to break things down. So they're really amazing molecules. And today we can make virtually any protein. And so there's a whole, and more than that, AI tools can design and understand these proteins. In fact, the Nobel Prizes in 2024 were handed out to the researchers that had done the work doing analysis of proteins and design of proteins. So it's really an incredible field to be in right now. So huge play space, huge sandbox that's now allowing us to build some of the most important components and systems in biology.
What are the key applications? What does it allow us to do?
Well, it depends. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of the most powerful proteins in medicine is the antibody, essentially a protein that binds specifically to a target and then recruits other systems to eliminate it. So it's a key part of our immune system. We started to make what's called monoclonal antibodies many decades ago. These are essentially a large number of very specific antibodies that binds to a particular target. And this made some of the most powerful cancer medicines, for example, because some cancer cells have known receptors on their surface that are specific to the cancer. And now we can use an antibody that binds to that, and that allows the immune system to come in and eliminate that cancer. So that's one application. But there's others. There's enzymes that can, for example, break down plastics. So these types of enzymes can have been used to degrade plastic bottles very quickly. So you can use that for cleaning up the environment. And we've got other enzymes that put things together. Basically, all of biology runs on enzymes, so which are all made of proteins. So the application space goes from foods to medicines to materials and on. So very, very, very powerful tools for being able to shape the world around us.
And regarding the state of the art today, for you, what types of person are concerned by those new technologies and should become aware of that? Is that scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs, or average person that should look into that?
Well, these technologies have been evolving for really as long as I've been alive. Like the first genetic engineering was done in the early 1970s. Before that, we were still figuring out how these systems really operated at a molecular level. But in the early 1970s, we started to get the technologies for manipulating biological systems at the molecular scale. So today they have wide interest. They're used by industry. If you have laundry detergent, it's got engineered enzymes in it to break down the proteins that we get on our clothes. They're used in industrial processes every single day. They're used in medicine. They're used in health. So there's always been a wide interest. And yes, there's been some fear around engineering organisms to produce, as we started to reprogram them. But in general, those fears are tend to be quite specific. People don't want to eat, for example, many people don't want to eat engineered foods, anything that's been tinkered with. But in general, it's a very small percentage of people that fear these technologies. And in fact, over the last few decades, they've found their way into our everyday lives and they've proven themselves very safe. My only concern in general with programming biology is viruses, because viruses, as we've just gone through a pandemic in the last few years. We realize that one little virus particle with the right dynamics can affect the world. And today we have the ability to program viruses with these tools. And I think the tools for monitoring and detecting viruses and countering viruses, things we've done typically with vaccines and over the last few decades as we've understood viruses and epidemics. I think our defense systems have lagged behind our ability to construct. So this is going to need to be equalized. And I speak on this. In some ways, it mirrors our experience with computing, because I'm old enough to remember the first computers and the first networks, and the people that built those didn't think of how they could be abused or hacked. And we ended up having to build an entire industry, cybersecurity, to protect us from the hackers. And in some ways, biology already has security built in. We have immune systems, we have cellular and organism scale defenses. But now we have to augment our natural systems with systems to make sure that humans can't abuse it either.
So what will be those systems?
Some of those systems are already emerging. One is, if you have when you design and build biology with synthetic biology or digital biology, you're using computer-based tools, and that's virtual. So you can build checkpoints in the software to make sure that people aren't designing something harmful by accident or design. So you can build some of that there. And then there's a huge crossover from the virtual into the real world. And usually that's at the level of the DNA printer. Before that, it's just code, and then it becomes real world biology, bits to atoms. And so there's a lot of effort there to make sure there's security at the DNA printer level. But that's not sufficient. For example, when a new virus appears and starts to spread, often we don't detect it for weeks or months because our main detection is people getting sick and going to the hospital, or a plant species suffering from a blight, or an animal species starting to die, like with bird flu or swine flu. So we need real world detection systems as well for these particles. And we haven't really built and deployed those at wide scale. And in fact, some of the monitoring systems that have been in place, established by the US and other agencies, have seen reductions in funding post COVID. And so in some ways we're getting more and more blind to some of these circulating particles. So there's let's just say it's an ongoing challenge because Mother Nature produces billions and trillions and trillions, countless trillions of these particles, and we still don't have the detection systems that we need to kind of monitor them in real time. But that being said, more and more groups are coming along and devising these technologies and building networks to share this information. So it's a challenge that can be overcome with coordination.
And you use a comparison between informatics and biology and the basic pair with the binary system. To what extent is that comparison useful for us to understand biology or to think about new ideas? Is it a comparison by coincidence? Are there some key insights we can gain from that?
No, it's a good question. I take most of my insights about the dynamics of programming biology from our learned history of programming computer systems. Because when you think about it, computer systems are one of the few universal systems that humans have created. Uh, they all, there's only a small number of operating systems. The way information moves over networks is very standardized. And so, and the dynamic, and man, so many people use computer systems. Like over half the global population has access to a computer. So these, when we built these computer networks, we were naive and we didn't understand how people would use them. They've spawned new surprising industries and continue to do so, and they evolve very quickly. So as we move to programming biology, many of the same dynamics, many of the same economies are at play. And so I like to say that, yeah, it's a very different medium for programming. You're not programming bits, you're programming atoms and molecular systems that exist in the real world, but it's the same individuals sitting in front of the keyboards doing the programming. So the human dynamics are very similar. So we're driven by solving problems, we're driven by curiosity. Some of us are driven by greed, some of us are driven by fear. Some of us just want to hack or disrupt systems. Thankfully, that last group is a very small percentage, but they exist. So anytime you have people that want to break systems or disrupt systems, you end up having the opportunity to build defense systems, which today are a huge business as well. But it's always kind of predator prey, and you see these dynamics play out in human society all the time. You see it play out in ecologies all the time, and you certainly see it play out in computer networks. So we're learning as we go, but I just want us to learn from our history of computing so that we don't repeat the big mistakes, the big hard lessons learned. Like we don't need to crash the network. We don't need to crash the systems.
Okay. And on the project, the Human Genome Project, right? Can you present a little bit on what you are working?
Yeah, so the organization will have its 10-year anniversary in 2016, but it's rooted in the first Human Genome Project. Now, the first Human Genome Project was to read the code of a human being. It was proposed in the 1980s, so over 40 years ago. It was funded in the late 1980s with the US Congress back when they still had money. and and it was launched in 1990 with Jim Watson, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, at the helm of that project. Of course, he just recently passed away. So, and the whole idea was, look, if we can develop technologies and tools to read the human genome, then we can understand our biology better because we can actually look at the program and we can use that information to understand human biology better, but in health and disease. So it's an amazing diagnostic tool. It was really ambitious at the time because we hadn't even developed the tools and technologies to sequence the first bacterium. The first bacterium, the smallest cellular life, was sequenced 5 years into what would be a 15-year project. So we really are human centric in our thinking about genomics. That's my whole point. So of course, we completed the Human Genome Project in 2003. And again, this is to read the genome. So it came in early and on budget, which was surprising, but that's because the technology was moving so quickly. But by 2010, we'd already synthesized and booted up the first bacterial genome. Craig Venter did that in 2010 and his team. So that was significant. There was a growing field of starting to look at programming biology, synthetic biology, as it was called, but there was no similar effort, big moonshot effort to go and synthesize the human genome, which would have brought a lot of attention into synthetic biology. So I wrote an essay back then saying, "Is it time for another genome project? We seem to be overdue." And in 2015, I was able to seed an effort with some amazing scientists from around the world to go and say, "Look, yeah, it's kind of time to go and put together another moonshot grand challenge project, this time around synthesizing the human genome so we can understand how to build very large genomes, billions of bases, learn chromosomal structure, how to move big DNA in and around." And it got a lot of attention. So we ended up pulling together about 1,000 scientists globally and ran meetings for years. We've paused it in the last few years because we didn't pull in a big major funder to go and support this work. But now the UK has recently launched a similar effort to go and start building human chromosomes called SynHG. And I think that it's another academic project like the Human Genome Project, right? And so I think it's time to revisit the Human Genome Project, right? And just these efforts. And I think we're starting to see the energy come in around that. So I think this is a really good time to be looking at genome engineering.
What does it mean precisely synthesizing the human genome? Like you are doing it from zero and you create all the DNA information? Or what is it really?
So it starts with building the core technologies that allows you to write a lot of DNA and assemble DNA inexpensively and to start to build chromosomes. Humans have 23 chromosomes, 22 autosomal and then the sex chromosomes, X and Y. The smallest chromosomes are around 50 million base pairs. The largest are around 250 million. So it's a really big synthesis job, and we don't know how to do it. So it really means that we start having to learn how to build chromosomes. And over the last 15 years, we've done that with yeast. Yeast, the same yeast that you use for making bread and beer. So we've started to learn chromosome engineering. We've started to learn how to assemble these large fragments. The tools are still quite crude, but having a big moonshot project like you're going to do this for the human genome, it pulls together the technologies and resources to keep learning how to do this. Now, I don't want to I want to be absolutely clear. This doesn't mean you're going to make engineered humans, or human babies. This means it's all work in cell culture. You're learning how to build chromosomes and replace them one at a time, the natural chromosome with one that's been engineered. So it's really just a lot of lab work. It's not going to turn into applications tomorrow. But what it opens, in the same way that the Human Genome Project READ allows us now to do diagnostics of rare diseases, of cancer, of variation that can increase medical risk for everything from heart disease to cancer. The ability to write genomes gives you the potential to correct any genetic disease, no matter how complex. So this is not, it's a goal that will take decades just to get to the starting line. But along the way, you improve your technologies for being able to program any living thing, bacteria, viruses, plants, and other creatures. So it kind of the human is at the very top of the pyramid, but all our work and the tools, really come in from the bottom. So I think there's huge potential down the road, but this is stuff that will play out, until 2050.
Thank you. And regarding the potential risk, we talked about potential viruses, and some people say that there is a possibility that the COVID-19 originated from a lab. Do you have an opinion about it?
I don't, in the sense that I've heard arguments on both sides. The evidence tends to point that it was a natural spillover, but because the Chinese have not been very forthcoming with the records, because there's people love a good controversy. The idea of a lab leak in Wuhan is certainly very popular. Virus engineering is a common thing. I reserve my opinion, but the opinion that I do state is we cannot allow virus engineering to be done in the dark. I believe we have to. It's if we're engineering viruses, we have to do things like put in watermarks so that we know it's engineered and we know who engineered it. It's like putting a barcode on a product. We Anything that's been engineered in the world today, a building, a bridge, the engineers have to sign off on it. That's so we know who to go back to if there's a problem. And I think that's really important in bioengineering. And clearly we don't have the structures in place to trace back anything that's engineered to the original creators, and that's what we need to fix. Of course, if Mother Nature made it, then there won't be signatures, there won't be watermarks, and that can happen. We get natural pandemics. We've had them in the past. We'll get them in the future. But if it's something that's been done by a human with intention, with the tools and systems that we have, we should be able to trace it back. If maybe it was by accident, but we need to make sure that we don't repeat those accidents again.
Thank you. And how do you think that we can enforce it, that we can see that people in the laboratories are doing it?
That's a really great question. I think it really requires a human level meeting of minds where we're basically like in the United Nations, we get together and say, look, bioengineering isn't going away, but there's some real risk to it. And those risks are essentially could be potentially as great as nuclear weapons. The right virus can almost eliminate a species given the right dynamics. Now that's unlikely, but still causing very large scale suffering or death is within reach. So I think it's one of those things where we have to come together and say, look, let's build an open, transparent layer for people working on viruses. And that way we'll all watch each other's back, we'll check each other's work, and if there's a problem, we'll share the problems. And we've built these types of systems before. The example I like to use is global air traffic. Different languages, different cultures, different, tools and technologies. But we've gotten together and said, look, if we want the skies to be safe for passengers and for this industry, to thrive, we need to all work together. We've done other things like share weather data, so we know what the weather is going to be on the planet. But I think the airline industry and air traffic is a really great example of managing a complex system with a lot of moving parts and making it so safe that you're more likely to die driving to an airport than flying on an airplane. So it's hard, it's difficult work, but we can make it work. And I think that's one of the things we need to do as a species moving forward with bioengineering. And if we can achieve that level of safety when it comes to viruses, that opens the door to doing much more complex things safely. And no cell can take over the world. Like it just moves too slowly. It's too easy to kill with antibiotics. No larger creature can take over the world. I'm not worried about tigers roaming through cities, attacking people randomly. It's really the virus that has the potential to replicate quickly, spread globally, and cause serious disease. And it's so invisible and difficult to counter because it's not a living organism. It's essentially a piece of software. so so I'm this is one of my highest priorities in terms of communication today. I was much more optimistic we'd sort this out before COVID, but during COVID we were so disorganized that I realized, coming out of COVID, we really need to start to work together to build a global monitoring system for viruses, either engineered or natural.
And also, without speaking about large risks, there are also a lot of small scale projects regarding food, regarding also genetically modified mosquitoes, for instance. You
Yeah.
address in your book the machine genesis, the question about who is involved in the decision and what are the risks of those small scale projects. Can you maybe present a little bit about who is making the decisions, maybe in the US or Europe, about this kind of project?
Well, these types of projects go through regulatory agencies. The example of using the gene drive in mosquitoes was actually an example. The researchers there went right into the communities where they were going to plan releases and talked with people to educate them, get feedback, and they move very conservatively and slowly on that type of work. But in general, biology is one of the most regulated industries after finance. So there's, if anything, what we need is more cooperation between the various agencies and education of people about these technologies. It took most of my life for computers to be considered everyday devices and to make them easy enough and safe enough for people to trust using them for shopping or with their banking. I don't expect this to happen overnight. And many people that watch these genetic engineering technologies emerge were fearful that we would go and crash species or ecosystems or make huge mistakes. And many of these ideas were reinforced by Hollywood movies that love to play the dark side, right? Even the early days of computers and robots, it's all the dark side, whether it's Terminator or war games. I think the reality is much more complex. But today I'm seeing a new generation of scientists, of communicator, of just awareness in the general public about these technologies because they're seeing them being used every day. And when they go and get new diagnostic treatments, whether they're today you can get your genome sequenced for a few $100s and get health and ancestry reports. We're seeing it being used for new cancer therapies every single day, rare diseases, diagnostics and treatments. We're seeing it show up in more and more products, even in things like our not so much foods because the main crops have been genetically engineered in the US and in many parts of the world for decades now, and we know that they're safe. Where we're starting to see it is in things like dyeing clothing. We still use many chemical dyes that can be quite toxic. Now we're starting to see biological equivalents. In general, as we move away from the chemical industry towards the biochemical industry, and these products start to move into our everyday lives, I think people are much more accepting. So it shifts over time. You'll never make everyone happy. Some people just want nature left completely untouched, but then we go in and bulldoze rainforests. So I don't know. There's everything changes all the time is part of my philosophy, and we get choices, and I hope we steer these choices to respecting life, respecting nature, but also using these incredibly powerful and sustainable tools that nature provides us to make the world more sustainable and deliver the products and services we need for abundance.
And do you think that there are some boundaries that we should respect regarding the enhancements, the modifications we make? Like, for instance, people are speaking about the X and Y chromosomes, saying we should not have a modification of the germline genes, but also focus on the autosomal genes. Do you think that these kinds of boundaries or other are useful?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the potential challenges around how these technologies are used, discuss them, and ultimately put in guardrails. So the difference between somatic and germline is, look, if I do a genetic modification to myself, it stays with me. But if it reaches my germline, then I can pass it on to my kids. And we don't know what modifications that go into the germline will how it will affect the next generation. So I think we have to be careful there. That being said, I don't think it's an unsolvable problem. But and there's many, like, we're going to see more and more gene therapies be used, but most of those will be used on adults. The type we're starting to see the first companies come along and say we do want to do corrections to the embryo, the human embryo, to correct major genetic diseases in the embryo. So things like muscular dystrophy, for example. And that's pretty impressive that we're starting to do this, to think about how to do it and do it properly. But this is just emerging now, and there will be years of discussion and regulatory, decisions to be made. But yeah, the world is, we always push up against boundaries, and we learn, and then we, either go through them or not. But really, in my worldview, there's really two areas that are very controversial, and one is the virus engineering, the other one is human engineering, and I'll be forthright. We don't know how to engineer humans to make us better. Like, we don't. We might be able to identify a major disease and correct it, but we don't know how to engineer ourselves to be smarter or live longer or have, any, major change. But, these technologies will continue to grow and evolve as long as we're alive. So what it will be like for my children, for my children's children, is really hard to predict today, particularly why the tools are still so crude.
Regarding the enhancements of humans, so we don't master all the technologies right now, but what would be in principle feasible in the next decades?
Oh man. So these technologies for tinkering with humans?
Yes.
Is that the question? So right now we know we've identified about 10,000 diseases that have a single gene that we know causes that disease. I think that we are going to get a lot better at correcting many of those ultra rare diseases. This is going to take a huge shift in the way we develop medicines. And I'm starting to see the beginning of that change. So the most positive changes that I'm seeing today, as we start to learn more about human life and how we operate, is that we're getting better at diagnosing disease, and we're going to get better at curing or treating rare diseases, and we are going to get much better at treating infections, both bacterial and cancer. Cancer is an infection caused by your own cells. No two cancers are the same. So we're getting the tools now to diagnose individual cancers at high resolution and to treat those cancers individually. That to me is hugely exciting. Another area of research that I think could have huge applications moving forward is what we're doing to understand the arc of aging, which is ultimately dictated by our programs. Some organisms live for thousands of years. Sharks will live for 200 years. There's some organisms we don't know if they have a fixed end date. So, but our dynamic is shared. And as we start to do the research on how biology works, we're starting to realize we can change the arc of the aging process. We're learning this in mice and other model organisms. But with enough research, we could really see human life go extend 10, 20, 30% by learning how to make these shifts. And I believe that if we ever get comfortable programming humans, like being able to build our genomes, we might even be able to extend our life much more than that, because now we get full control over the design of our biology. But that's potentially as far out as a century, because we don't know how to do that engineering yet. This is why the company that I'm founding right now is not to engineer humans, it's to back them up, because so that we can have other life cycles. Nothing we see it today with animals. We know how to restore animals through cloning. We know how to today, if you have a dog or a cat, you can literally bank your dog or cat's biology and put it in a biobank and restore them later. So very similar to what we do with computer systems, backup and restores. And I believe it's time to start thinking about doing that with our own biology.
And can you present the company you mentioned?
Yeah, this is one that I've been incubating for a very long time and giving talks about and feeling out how people feel about it. And because we're putting billions of dollars into understanding longevity, how we can live longer, healthier lives. But at the end of the day, we're still going to die. Everything that's born dies. But today we understand enough about biological processes that we can potentially restore. And again, we're doing this ever since Dolly the sheep. We've been cloning animals, not so different than ourselves. And today the list is growing. And so it's a service today if you want to clone your dog or your cat or your horse or your camel, and people do. So death is finite for the individual, but reusing a biological program and essentially restoring from a backup is technically feasible. So I'm not pushing to clone humans today. That's an ethical barrier, not a technical barrier. But my belief is down the road in the future, whether it's 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I have no idea. But one day cloning won't be controversial, cloning of humans. We'll push through that barrier just like we did with the first IVF babies. And we'll just realize cloning just produces another baby. That's my belief. But today, we're seeing many people die, as they just age out. And some of my favorite actors, scientists, and others pass, family members. But I know that if I just had a few of their cells properly cryopreserved, then there's the potential to bring back a twin of them down the road. So I'm creating a company, I call it Chromosome 24, to back up people, bank their biology, just cells. We don't need your body or your head, just some cells, and back up information about you, because today we leave in our wake terabytes of information, photographs, videos, medical data, other things. So collect all that data and then bank money, because as we all know, a human life is expensive. Today it's costing, something like $30,000 to $40,000 a year per kid in the US, to raise them, which is crazy numbers. Crazy numbers. But you need to bank money to be able to restore an individual. So I just call it triple banking. And nothing needs to be invented in doing this. It's all an exercise in foresight. That yes, you're going to die, and yes, you can have a twin brother or sister down the road, and give them financial resources, informational resources, and biological resources that they wouldn't have if they were just a child and a typical offspring. So I have two children myself. This is not This is not about me continuing. It's about establishing different life cycles and being able over time to separate what's the contribution of our genome versus the contribution of our environment, nature
Yeah.
versus nurture.
And exactly, let's say you clone a human, but what would be the difference between the new individual and the previous one regarding that they don't have the same lives? So what would be the impact of the DNA versus the environment?
Yeah, well, we don't know. Like again, identical twins are natural clones. So we know, the idea that they share a soul, that's just crazy. Like we know that they're individuals. So every person born is an individual. But when it comes, you find cases of identical twins, one gets cancer, the other one doesn't. The only difference with cloning is the identical twins are born at very different times. They have different birthdays. So, the with cloning you can pass on biological and health information to the next to the progenitor, which is fascinating to me. It's kind of like being born with an instruction manual. That being said, we don't know. You actually have to live the life to start collecting the data. So, but after a number of cloning processes, you have a pretty good idea of what breeds true, whether it's physical appearance, mathematical ability, health, but they're always being born at a later date with better technology, right? So and in a different environment. So every life is unique, every time is unique, every experience, the experiences they have will be unique. I'm just fascinated by the idea that death is no longer the end of a particular genome of a particular instance. And certainly in the animal world, I was just reading an article in Wired magazine the other day about the cloning of polo horses. And one particular cloned polo horse has the same capabilities as, very similar capabilities as the original. And that just makes it like an amazing polo horse. So, and I've seen in Seoul, Korea, they're cloning drug sniffing dogs and finding that those clone dogs have similar abilities, to be very sensitive and very good at sniffing drugs. So we just don't know what it's going to be like for humans because identical twins are typically have the same birthday.
Yeah.
So, but I'm fascinated to find out. And again, not pushing it. All this in my worldview, cloning of humans will be as acceptable as IVF in the future.
And what's the use case? Like, who would like to become a client of your company and want to have him cloned?
Yeah, I've actually sat down with ChatGPT and said, build me archetypes for the type of people who would like this.
Yeah.
And for me, it's curiosity. I know enough about biology to realize, I'm going to die, but two, I can be rebooted, or at least a twin. And I find that fascinating. So for me, it's kind of this biological intellectual curiosity. But some people are really into archiving. So some people they create huge scrapbooks of information where they just, where they store as much information about their life as possible. And I find that strange, but people do this. And in that case, just archiving their biology at the same time would be just kind of standard. Other people might archive themselves not so much for cloning, but because they may one day want to produce organs or tissues that can be used for treatment. Some people, and biological archiving can also include gametes. Lots of people bank their eggs today. Some people bank sperm. The sooner you do that in life, generally the better it is because we collect biological corruptions. So I've got a list of like 9 different archetypes that might be interested in backups for various reasons. But really, at this point, I'm doing it because of my own curiosity and because I read the book Dune and Dune Messiah when I was very young. Frank Herbert was a science fiction author that was great at world building. And of course, the movies are quite popular. But there was one character in those books. And I read these when I was like single digits. But there was one character, Duncan Idaho, who is in all the books that Herbert wrote because he is essentially serially cloned through time. And the book covers like a 5,000 year period. And so I was just fascinated by that. Like, oh, if you can, now granted, he gets his consciousness back eventually as well. So he has a singular consciousness. So he's a great MacGuffin in the book in the sense that he has a long memory of all the events that have happened in the past. But I found that fascinating because, before Dolly, once you died, you were dead. You were completely dead. But after Dolly, there was this possibility that, you're just mostly dead and that you can be rebooted. And that to me is so that made Duncan, Idaho from the books a possibility. So it's always been in the back of my mind that, yeah, I need to be backed up and one day I'd like to be restored. Maybe I've learned that if I feel that way, there's probably a small market out there.
So one of the applications is to clone yourself, for instance, and to have another individual with the same DNA, so a twin. And another application is to have your DNA stored so that you, in the lab, you could create medications for your own health if you have health issues. So there are two different applications.
Yeah, there's many applications. So right now we don't do a lot of biological backups. Probably the most common biological backup that I'm aware of is cord blood banking. Like people bank sperm and they bank eggs if they're doing IVF, but really most people only bank their cells if they're undergoing full body radiation treatments for cancer. Then they pull out stem cells from bone marrow and store them so that they can repopulate. But really the most common biobanking that we do today is cord blood. And cord blood is collected at birth. It's rich in stem cells, and people set up biobanks to say, look, in some rare cases, you may need stem cells, and before we could generate them, you had to have them stored as kind of a biological insurance policy. Today, we can generate stem cells at will, so the industry is kind of flatlined. But that being said, having stem cells banked allows you to go and think about things like tissue engineering, making organoids for drug testing, one day potentially being able to make organs for transplant from your own cells or tissues. And of course, if you've got banked stem cells, there's the potential you could be cloned as well. So if anything, I'm just championing adult biobanking and and really some projection into the future to say, yeah, you can have a twin brother or sister if you so choose, and you can reuse your genetic program so so you can learn and evolve as an individual even after you're dead. So I find that intellectually really stimulating and kind of I just want to see it happen. This is not about trying to change my mortality. Statistically, I'm going to live to 81 years. Anything after that is bonus time. But the youth really is wasted on the young. And I love the idea of different life cycles, particularly because I would like to have different life cycles with my wife. On our first year anniversary, I gave her a card with two skeletons holding hands, and it said, death do us part is for quitters. So for me, it's fun. It's intellectually stimulating. It's biologically tractable. It's not hard. And it makes for some fascinating conversations like this with some really smart people. So the real goal for me in the next year is, can I make it a sustainable business? And it's not the banking that's hard. It's building a company that can last and endure long enough to be able to do restores. And that's the really interesting side of the conversation.
And right now, the genetics application and research is really in the laboratories and with the researchers. And do you think that in the next years or decades, where we will see the evolution of technologies, there will be a democratization of those technologies to allow people, average people, to do some enhancement or medicine or themselves and to have a more direct relationship to genetics?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I think it happens slowly and then it starts to accelerate. I'm a strong believer that your body is your own and that you should have control over that. And self-experimentation, which has historically been a part of medicine, I think could see a resurgence as more and more options for self manipulation appear. I think it's, if you're offering as a product or a service, then there's liabilities. There's certain, claims that are very hard to substantiate. So I don't see it being, but but as these tools do democratize, I think we're going to see people biohacking. In many ways, we biohack already. If you're changing your diet, you're biohacking. If you're going to the gym, you're biohacking. If you're taking any supplements, vitamins, medicines, peptides, whatever, you're biohacking. And I think there's room, and I think it's an important facet of medicine to collect these edge cases and start to process them as meta studies to figure out how we move forward. Because individually we're all different. Even identical twins have very different immune systems, for example, very different microbial populations. So I can definitely see a path where people start to explore this more if they're given access to the tools. And certainly, we're seeing it play out in making the next generation. There's a company, Orchid, that's been getting a lot or Nucleus Genomics, that's been getting a lot of attention because they're promising in prospective parents that they can screen embryos and deliver certain traits. So we're starting to see people say, oh, if I have a choice, then I'm going to choose, the best baby I can have. Eventually, we might have the option to do embryo adjustments to reduce the likelihood of certain diseases or cancer. That's coming. And that's really controversial. But you can see parents, if they're going to invest a lifetime of raising their children, they really want to choose, to have the best child they can possibly have. This is new territory. And even for me, my kids were made by IVF, and we did genetic testing on the embryos, at least one of my kids, because it wasn't available for the other one. So we could rule out major genetic diseases in that child, but you just don't know what you're going to get. Every child is different. And if I learned anything from this whole process of having children, is they seem to be born with a personality the day they pop out. And it just blossoms more and more as they get older. So anyway, we'll see how it plays out. But I'm looking forward. I wish I could see the results of me being cloned 20, 30, 50 years in the future. I don't know. I think it's fascinating. So I'm already writing letters to my future self.
His instructions. Okay.
Yeah. It's a really interesting exercise. What I usually encourage people to do, like, look, young people look at these technologies much more realistically and openly than older folks. We're seeing a lot of the old guard, whether it was in ethics or science, die off now. They say that science advances one funeral at a time. What I want to encourage people to do is stay open and curious. We're going through this huge transition right now. We've seen so many. Look, in 2000 to now, we've seen the rise of mobile. We see the rise of the internet. Now we're in this AI boom that we don't even know where it's going to take us. After AI is changing everything in the digital world, biology has the ability to change everything in the material world. This is a living planet. That's what makes Earth different than Mars or Venus. Like, this is a planet where life is the defining characteristic, but now we're learning how to engineer life. And that is a massive transition. So the combination of AI and bio, it's a superpower. It truly is. So, you know, there's always choppy waters in any transition, but I really encourage people to be open-minded, think about what they want, communicate about what they want, and yeah, we're growing and learning every single day. So, pick up the book. I've been telling people about my friend's book as well. Adrian Wolfson has a book called On the Future of Species coming out in February. Absolutely amazing. And there's other books about the origins of life and where these technologies are going that I think are not only really good at laying a foundation, but are inspiring. And for young people, check out the iGEM program, International Genetically Engineered Machines. Companies like Adaptive that are now doing bioengineering challenges online. Yeah, huge opportunities for young people to apply their skills, not just programming computers, but in changing the world around them.